So I'm going to kick off this session. Welcome, everybody. I hope you had an excellent tea and coffee break. We're going to talk about research strategies. We've got three excellent speakers. We're starting with Barny Foot, who I'd like to introduce to you virtually. Barny's been a stalwart of all things BOSU related. It's a fantastic program. It's been going for many years, and it's produced some excellent research outputs. So without more ado, Barny, over to you.
Thank you for inviting me to talk on rare eye disease surveillance in the UK and the work of the British Ophthalmological Surveillance Unit. I'd like to thank the Royal College of Ophthalmologists and Fight for Sight who support this work. I'm going to briefly describe health surveillance and some of its common applications and how we apply these techniques to support rare eye disease research, and then go on to discuss the characteristics that make a condition or rare event suitable for health surveillance, and how to set up a study through the BOSU, and then briefly detail some of the past studies that we've undertaken and their impacts. Let's start with a definition of health surveillance. The most common one used by the BOSU is from Langmuir, from the New England Journal of Medicine in 1963, which defines surveillance as, when applied to a disease, it means the continued watchfulness over the distribution and trends of incidence through the systematic collection, consolidation and evaluation of morbidity and mortality reports and other relevant data. Intrinsic in the concept is the regular dissemination of the basic data and interpretations to all who have contributed and to all others who need to know. So this describes the full cycle of collecting the data, analysing it and feeding it back, which is of course an essential element in order for health surveillance to have impact. There are one or two additional types of surveillance, but the main types are either active or passive, with the key difference being that in an active system, researchers solicit a regular response from participants, either a positive response or a negative response, whereas in a passive system, researchers only request to receive the positive case reports as and when they are seen. There are two main advantages of active surveillance. Firstly, trials suggest it elicits up to twice as many case reports, and secondly, participation levels are known, which gives a valuable indication of ascertainment. That is to say that in a passive system, you have no idea if non-responders have seen a case and not notified it, or if they have not seen any cases. But by collecting negative responses, or nothing to report responses, knowledge on the levels of ascertainment, and thus the completeness of the data set, are greatly enhanced. So the BOSU operates a population-based rare eye disease surveillance system across the UK. This is a globally unique system that supports the epidemiological study of rare diseases of public health or scientific importance. This enables us to answer questions on incidence, describe management outcomes, and establish cohorts for comparison studies, most commonly case control studies to establish risk factors. We have, for the past 25 years, been operating a yellow card reporting system, and here's an example here on the screen, where we send out a yellow card every month to UK ophthalmologists, detailing the list of conditions under surveillance and providing a box in which they can notify the number of cases that they've seen, and also that important nothing to report box, which they tick and return the majority of the time, and that's essentially what makes this an active surveillance system. The entire system is shown here on this flow diagram, where you can see the BOSU office sending out the yellow report card to ophthalmologists. They then return the yellow card along that bottom arrow, which indicates whether they've seen a case or not, and that comes back to the BOSU office. And when a case has been reported, we inform the researcher who then contacts the ophthalmologist directly with a pre-approved questionnaire to collect the clinical data, and the exchange of data operates solely between the ophthalmologist and the researcher. All UK ophthalmologists are included on the reporting base and are asked to indicate cases of interest or if there is nothing for them to report each month. And in doing so, they contribute towards higher ascertainment and the completeness of the data sets, which enables meaningful epidemiological analysis and underpins both the validity of the findings and also an indicator for the ascertainment achieved. Although up to now we have relied upon a postal surveillance system, the BOSU is currently developing an integrated digital reporting system with a planned transition early next year. This will maintain all the elements of the current approach, but bring together the yellow card reporting system with the collection of the study data into a single, secure online system that will also ensure the highest standards of information governance for all studies. There will be additional functionality with the option for ophthalmologists to report a case when it's seen, not just at the end of the month, and also for some involvement for ophthalmologists in training. The benefits for this over the current postal-based system are evident for all involved. For researchers, there will be an online management and distribution of questionnaires, and the data transferred directly to a study-specific database held in a data safe haven. A streamlined research ethics committee and information governance approval process, and this could be a potential game changer for many, especially those for whom their BOSU study is one of their first research experiences. For reporting ophthalmologists, there will be a one-click response embedded into the monthly email that will allow them to indicate nothing to report, which will be just as quick as the current system. Cases can be reported via the monthly surveillance email or prior to that as they are seen in the clinic. Data questionnaires will be available to be completed instantly at the point of reporting or later whenever is convenient. And there will be a personal dashboard for each ophthalmologist to manage their case reports and to download their personal participation records for appraisals or CPD. Studies are judged to be suitable for rare eye disease surveillance based on three main criteria. Firstly, they obviously have to be rare, and our definition of rarity is a population incidence of less than 5 per million, which roughly equates to 300 cases per annum in the UK. In practice, most studies are far below this level and tend to have a frequency of between 75 and 150 cases per year. There has to be an identifiable denominator population in order to be able to calculate the incidence rate, and the topic has to be deemed to be of high public health or scientific importance, with the potential for impact on either service provision or further research. The BOSU has been supporting studies successfully for 25 years, and amongst other things, this success has been based upon the structure of healthcare in the UK, where all rare conditions should present to a consultant in the UK, thus allowing for a link between those cases reported and the underlying UK population. Other factors influencing success include the fact that it is a prospective study, which reduces the influence of certain types of bias, and that all applications are peer-reviewed by the BOSU committee, and this gives reporting ophthalmologists confidence in the quality and intentions of the studies, as well as helping to reduce the number of unsolicited questionnaires. New studies emerge from applications from ophthalmologists or researchers who have an interest in the epidemiology of rare eye diseases. The initial application, phase 1, determines the suitability of a topic for surveillance. This is typically about 2 pages long and provides background information, especially focusing on why the topic is of scientific or public health importance, and all include the proposed case definition and research questions that are hoped to be answered. It will also include an indication of likely numbers and the source of any denominator that will be used. And it should also include a section on the anticipated impact of the study on either service provision or future research. This application is then reviewed by the BOSU committee, and if the topic is considered suitable for surveillance, we invite a phase 2, which is the full proposal including data collection questionnaires. This is reviewed by the BOSU committee, and when ready, research approvals for ethics and information governance can then be obtained and the study can progress. The phase 1 form is available on the college website, although in reality the best bet is to actually contact the BOSU unit directly, either by email or by phone, to discuss any study before embarking on a phase 1. Good surveillance studies can come from any of the subspecialties, but do tend to have common features. The case definition needs to be based on symptoms, signs or investigations that are understood and interpreted consistently by reporting ophthalmologists. So conditions where standard diagnosis criteria exist, or something clear-cut like an air gun injury, is very helpful, whereas ambiguous definitions such as a collection of white dots at the back of the eye considered by a doctor to represent a certain diagnosis isn't really workable and wouldn't be accepted. Research questions similarly tend to be consistent across successful studies, and they usually focus on incidence, clinical presentation and demographics, management and outcome, although they can be broader to include other aspects such as risk factors where a control group exists or is able to be collected. As incidence is often the primary aim, I'll emphasise again the importance of a relevant denominator, as incidence is a rate, not just a number, and the lack of a meaningful denominator is another reason for studies not to progress. And as a unit, along with researchers, we work hard to make sure that questionnaires are brief and only collect information available in the patient records, and only information, again, that is necessary. This includes minimising identifiable data, and of course, as observational studies, there is no impact upon the patient care. A list of all the topics studied and the publications arising from those studies are available from the college website. Over here are some examples of those conditions and their research focuses. As I said earlier, the primary research focus for most studies is to look at incidence. And we've had examples of those are studies such as the British vision impairment studies, which have provided the world's only national data set on all-cause visual impairment in childhood, along with other conditions such as congenital toxoplasmosis and infections such as acute retinal necrosis or fungal keratitis. There have then been safety studies which have looked at post-operative endophthalmitis across a number of different procedures, as well as looking at endophthalmitis after intravitreal injections. There have been topics that have been important to the public health, such as firework or air gun injuries, ocular syphilis, or acanthamoeba keratitis, which has of course been particularly important for contact lens wearers. And then there are studies that have impacted on service provision, such as the harm due to delay study, which influenced college policy widely and had other political implications. There was the loss of vision in better eye in unilateral amblyopes, which is one of our earliest studies, and this had an importance on the role of preschool screening. And then there have been 2 studies on ROP treatment, which have helped with guideline development. In total to date, we have supported 84 different conditions that have been placed on the card, and we currently have a number of new studies ready to go with the launch of the digital system next year. We're always receiving new applications, and we have a number of applications currently under review. There's been a solid publication record with 81 papers appearing thus far in peer-reviewed journals, and we've had some good success at conferences too. We've been able to continue successfully for so long, really mainly for one major reason, and that is that the participation and efforts of UK ophthalmologists in returning their cards, reporting cases and completing questionnaires has been simply fantastic over such a long period of time. And this has allowed UK ophthalmology to have a resource that no other country has, that provides impactful studies of rare eye conditions that have implications for clinical practice and policy. And I suppose that finally I should just thank Fight for Sight, who have supported the unit in one way or another throughout its entire history, and of course the Royal College as well, which has provided great support too. Thank you.
That's great, Barney. Thanks very much. An excellent talk. And for everybody tuning in, please pass your questions through. We're going to have plenty of time for discussion. We'll take all questions for all 3 speakers at the end of the 3rd talk. So it gives me great pleasure next to introduce a friend, colleague, stalwart of ophthalmology in Aberdeen, John Olson, who tells me he's retiring. I can't quite believe it, but nevertheless, he'll tell us about Scottish powerhouse databases. And so without more ado, John, the floor's yours.
Thank you, Bal, for your kind words. I'm John Olson. I'm currently the Scottish Government lead for NES Digital Eye Care. Previously, I was a consultant ophthalmic physician at NHS Grampian and an honorary reader at the University of Aberdeen. I'd like to thank Roshni for inviting me to speak at this meeting and giving me the interesting title of Scottish Data Powerhouses. In case anyone's wondering, I won't be talking about power stations. My talk's in 3 parts: a story of perseverance, how retinal screening and Sky Diabetes transformed diabetes care in Scotland, and what NES Digital Eye Care, powered by Open Eyes, might do for eye care in Scotland too. Now to the first story, a story of perseverance that really ran for almost 20 years. So a little bit about me and how I got into research it. Even ophthalmology, in the beginning I didn't plan to do ophthalmology. I wanted to do general medicine, I wanted to do diabetes, and I got to the registrar stage in diabetes. But if you wanted to get a specialty training post, a senior registrar post in a medical specialty in those days, you had to do an MD. And this is essentially an unstructured research post that usually lasted 2 to 3 years. So I didn't really want to work in a laboratory, and to be absolutely honest, I didn't really want to do research. However, it was a necessity, and I undertook a clinical research fellow in diabetic retinopathy. This was a project run by the University of Aberdeen's Biomedical Physics Department and also by its Ophthalmology Department in conjunction with the Diabetes Service. It looked at digital imaging of diabetic retinopathy and applying that to a clinical trial of gamma-linolenic acid and seeing whether that had any effect on retinopathy. A very successful clinical trial for diabetic peripheral neuropathy had been undertaken before. In my study, I recruited 121 patients, of whom 98 patients finished the study. They all had type 1 diabetes, and they were randomized either to evening primrose oil or sunflower oil capsules. Every 3 months, they underwent fluorescent angiography and stem field stereoscopic photography for a total of 2 years. In those days, there was no such thing as a digital camera. Everything that was captured on film. Film had to be manually digitized if it was to appear on a computer, and then a number of people would work on the image, developing algorithms and trying to understand what was going on. The focus of research was all on detecting microaneurysms, which are, as we know, the earliest sign of diabetic retinopathy. And it was thought that to give the computer the best chance of being able to analyze the information, it would be best to do this using fluorescent angiography. This resulted in high resolution images which are essentially black or white, and where the microaneurysms would pool with dye and stand out to all. In those days, we taught the computer what to look for. In a digitized image, we would identify microaneurysms manually by clicking on them, and also other features such as blood vessels. And by doing this, by identifying where they actually were, then pixel profiles could be created of the various lesions that we were looking for. Here you can see the early results obtained in Aberdeen by medical scientists and by Russell Phillips, an ophthalmology trainee, where you can see in the upper curve, which is looking at the results obtained on film, the sensitivity of human observers compared to Russell was reasonable, although never as good. When you look at the lower curve, you can see the results obtained for digitized images compared to the original slides. And you can see that both the humans and the computer perform similarly, but digitization in those days was not very good. So I joined and continued the work that Russell had done, although he'd actually been responsible for developing some of the algorithms. That wasn't to be my role. My role was to run the clinical trial, provide the patients and their images for the biomedical scientists to analyze, and I essentially became the trainer for the computer. So out of 68 images, the computer presented a potential 1,627 candidates in all the images, and I had to go through and identify which ones I thought were the actual true positives, and I found 400 out of the 1,627. You then have to use the trained computer on a different test set to see what its true sensitivity and specificity is. So now we have results that are more meaningful, have reasonable sensitivity, getting up to 90% for manual grading, getting up to 80% for automated grading of digital images. There is a trade-off, however, for both manual grading and automated grading between sensitivity and specificity. So what about the results of the trial itself? Well, gamma-linolenic supplementation for diabetic retinopathy had neither any benefit nor any harm, and this was a little bit surprising because the reason the trial was undertaken was because a previous trial in diabetic peripheral neuropathy had shown very promising results. So what exactly was going on here? Why did this happen? Well, it appears that the doctor conducting the original research on diabetic peripheral neuropathy wasn't particularly honest. He essentially made up all his results and ended up in front of the GMC. Unusually for a clinical trial, he'd actually been promised a percentage of the royalty on sales of the drug. his preliminary study had been so apparently successful that it had convinced the drugs developer Scotia Holdings that it had a significant commercial future, and at the time Scotia Holdings was one of Britain's most promising biotechnology companies. The surprise rejection of Tarabetic's approval by the Medicines Control Agency dealt a fatal blow to Scotia, and this was a result of analysis of the results, which essentially showed that he had made the results up himself. As a result, not only did he appear in front of the GMC, but Scotia Pharmaceuticals folded. So, what to do next? Well, I had discovered that I actually liked research. There's a lot of misunderstandings about research, but essentially research is about learning to ask questions and to try and find answers. And I also had discovered that I liked ophthalmology and preferred that to going back to diabetes. So I was fortunate enough to become a senior registrar in medical ophthalmology. In fact, I was the first and last senior registrar in medical ophthalmology in Scotland, as shortly thereafter training became consolidated and you no longer had to compete between registrar and senior registrar to get a training number. In essence, we had developed an automated micron detector despite the disappointment of the clinical trial, so this was a very positive outcome. However, to obtain images, it required a very invasive procedure, fluorescein angiography, which is not something one wants to inflict on patients too often. The other thing we'd learnt about microatom detection, whether done by clinicians or by computer, was that you could either have a high sensitivity for your detection methodology, but that would lead to a low specificity, or you could set it to a low sensitivity and have a very high specificity. But this really meant it wasn't a particularly effective tool for drug trials. At the time, a new untested technology appeared, digital imaging. This involved what high resolution, at least we thought it was high resolution in those days, red-free digital photography performed on the same camera as used for obtaining film. So we thought, could the autograder and this new technology have a role in retinal screening? Neither fluorescein angiography nor 7-field photography were practical. Would autograding work as is on digital images? If microaneurysms are the first sign of retinopathy, could it have a role in sifting out those with no retinopathy from those that actually did? This led to a study that we undertook that was funded by the National Institute of Health Research in England, and it was a comparative evaluation of digital imaging, retinal photography and community optometrist examination in screening for diabetic retinopathy. Patients were recruited from the diabetic clinic at Aberdeen. Just over 1,000 patients were approached, and about half of them agreed to take part. All underwent all three screening modalities, including digital imaging, colour photography and slit lamp examination by trained community optometrists, in this case working in their own practices. The reference standard was slit lamp examination by ophthalmologists during their normal clinics. A 2-field photographic protocol was used. This had recently been shown to be equivalent to the traditional 7-field stereoscopic photographic protocol and was much more practical from a screening point of view. The characteristics of patients taking part in the trial were very similar to what you would expect for patients in general in the population. There was a minority of type 1 diabetes. The patients with type 2 tended to be older, and most patients had no retinopathy. One of the most interesting results that came out, and was perhaps entirely predictable, was that the technical failure rate was dramatically reduced by using digital images, whether you used the 2-field protocol or just looked at the macular field alone. And this is because if you took a digital image, you could tell immediately that it was a poor quality image and needed to be repeated, whereas with film you had to wait for it to be developed and to return from the laboratory before you knew whether you had a problem or not. So when we look at the results for referable retinopathy, patients with moderate background retinopathy or worse, new vessels, or macular edema, we can see that colour slide and digital images were very similar in terms of sensitivity and specificity for all fields and also for the macular field alone. For optometry, the specificity was very good, but the sensitivity was a little bit low. When you look at any retinopathy, i.e. is the image normal or is it not normal, then you could now look at the results of automation, and you could see that automation performed from a sensitivity point of view similar to manual grading of images for digital images in particular. The sensitivity was a bit low for both processes compared to colour slide photography. The conclusions that we made from the paper were that digital imaging was as effective as colour photography, but it had a much lower technical failure rate, which is important. One field was just as good as two, which immediately reduced the number of images that needed to be graded per eye by half. Slit lamp examination by community optometrists was not quite good enough for retinal screening, and the autograder itself had the potential for reducing the manual workload of a screen program by screening out patients who had no retinopathy. The results of this study were very important and became the backbone of Scotland's retinal screening program as it is today. Unlike England, we just use one field. This means that we don't have to dilate everybody to get images, and this is something that patients really appreciate. However, at this point, although the autograder was seen to have potential, the evidence was not thought to be sufficient to allow it to be introduced into actual practice. By this point, I had become a consultant, and I was still convinced that autograding had a really important role for retinal screening. And this time we approached the Chief Scientist's Office for a grant, and we undertook a larger study looking at disease-no disease grading in a systematic screening program, as by this point Grampian actually had a region-wide screening program, as did all boards in Scotland. Again, when we look at the grading results of the population screened, the vast majority had no retinopathy. For those patients that needed to be detected as having retinopathy or not having retinopathy, then automated grading had a higher sensitivity than manual grading, but a much lower specificity. Auto grading for this project had to be developed to be able to identify images of poor quality, because otherwise every image that the autograder looked at would have to be checked again to see whether it was a good quality image or not. And again, the autograder performed well compared to a manual grading. When we modelled the impact of autograding on workload, it was clear that autograding had a significant impact. The traditional model that was being used in Scotland was one of three level grading. You had level 1 graders who looked at all the images, level 2 graders who looked at images that are abnormal, and finally level 3 graders who decided whether patients needed to go to ophthalmology or not. So in a traditional setup, all patients would be graded by the level 1 grader, then a proportion of these would be regraded by the level 2 grader. However, the auto grader cut out the manual grading workload by 60%, and this clearly was going to be of benefit if only we could get it implemented. Well, unfortunately, it was felt still not to be good enough, despite being one of the largest studies ever on diabetic eye disease. Full stop. Lead clinicians, public health consultants wanted a bigger study done not just on Grampian's population. So we essentially undertook a very large-scale audit using arbitration by clinical experts, ophthalmologists, not in Aberdeen. And the way the study worked was that there were just over 33,535 patients from 2 screening programs. These were 5 in Glasgow. The images were all graded by the autograder, and the manual results were taken as is from the screening programs. Where there was a discrepancy between the autograder and the manual grading programs, then 7 ophthalmologists arbitrated the images. So what was the outcome? Well, the autograder detected all the patients with proliferative retinopathy, all the patients with referral retinopathy, all the patients with observable retinopathy, the vast majority of patients with referable maculopathy, and virtually all the ungradable images. This time, the manual grading workload reduction that would have resulted by using autograding was 36%. It was still useful, but perhaps not quite as high as expected. So a report was commissioned by the Scottish Diabetes Retinopathy Screening Collaborative, and this was undertaken by Professor Noel Waugh in the University of Aberdeen. He concluded that the evidence was sufficient, and it was accepted that this could now be implemented into the National Retinal Screening Programme. So where are we in 2021? Well, since 2012, it's been an integral part of Scotland's retinal screening programme, and it's just Grampian. The University of Aberdeen gave it free to NHS, and it has not led to any remuneration to myself or any of these bodies. However, we have had the satisfaction of actually seeing it in practice. It takes part in the normal safety testing that any screening programme undertakes. In Scotland, we undertake 6 monthly external quality assurance. Since 2018, to give an idea of the workload it undertakes, it processed 182,000 images, and just over half of these were final graded by the autograder, significantly reducing the manual grading workload. Where are we going to go with the autograder? Well, everyone's talking about artificial intelligence, and as Caroline Stiles, the lead clinician for retinal screening at the time in 2019, wrote in an editorial in Eye, it will be new to us that we don't understand or control exactly what artificial intelligence does. And this will be a new challenge, because up to now we've been able to give a pretty reasonable explanation of exactly how computer was able to identify microorganisms, but in the future we may well not be able to do so. So the next part of the story is about retinal screening and Sky Diabetes and how they have transformed diabetes care. So how? Well, historically, people with diabetes attended hospital diabetes clinics for direct ophthalmoscopy, because that was the only place where it was believed that retinal screening could safely occur. Retinal screening released that dependency, and its very creation led to register people with diabetes. Sky Diabetes is essentially an electronic patient record that allows information to be seamlessly shared between primary and secondary care. And as a result, there's a huge amount of information out there, and we know where everybody with diabetes is in Scotland. Diabetologists, as a result, have become the guardians of all diabetes care, not just that delivered in their clinics to those patients that they are aware of. Diabetes has become a matter of public health. One of the key outcomes of the Sky Diabetes is the production of a Scottish Diabetes survey every year. So we know exactly what's going on with the prevalence of diabetes, whether it's type 1 or type 2. It's clearly going up. When I was training in the 80s, 90s, it was thought that 1% of the population had diabetes, and another 1% had diabetes but didn't know it. Look at where we are now. We're up to almost 6%, heading towards 6% prevalence of diabetes. So, all good and well. How does that help? Well, Sky Diabetes enables boards to see how well they're performing compared to their neighbours. If you look at the insulin pump, which revolutionises the lives of people with type 1 diabetes, we're essentially freeing them from the regimented insulin injection regime and enabling them to eat freely. You can see that some boards are doing much better in this respect than others. Importantly, it's also empowering to patients, and patients can access Sky Diabetes through their own portal called My Diabetes My Way. And you can see that for type 1 diabetes, virtually half the population of patients with type 1 diabetes in Scotland are accessing My Diabetes My Way. Within My Diabetes My Way, there are lots and lots of tools. Not only can they find out and monitor their own results of HbA1c, blood pressure, etc., but they can also access very well written patient education, both written and in video. The combination of retinal screening data and Sky Diabetes data has also been extremely powerful. By so doing, we've been able to show that it's perfectly safe to extend the screening intervals for patients with no retinopathy from 1 year to 2 years, and this is going to have a massive impact on retinal screening and is currently being introduced into the National Retinal Screening Programme. So what about NERS Digital Eye Care powered by Open Eyes? So what is it? Well, just like the Sky Diabetes, it's more than just an electronic patient record. It's a unique opportunity to transform the eye health of Scotland. We are concentrating initially on cataract, but we are also moving on to medical retina, glaucoma, acute referrals, and more to come in the years ahead. There are many different health boards in Scotland, all with different journeys, but with the same destination in mind. Who is it for? It's for patients. Hopefully more effective care will result. It's for hospital eye services, but also community optometry. New ways of working will emerge, and education needs of optometrists and also hospital will also emerge and be addressed. It will enable boards to plan services more effectively. It will provide a national data set to Public Health Scotland that clinicians and researchers can use. It will enable the Scottish Government to performance manage both ophthalmology and perhaps optometry in more effective ways than it's ever been able to do so, and it will lead to lots of different research, not just artificial intelligence, but also best practice of clinical care. What will it answer? Why are there so many different clinical pathways in Scotland for same conditions? Why so many different post-operative drug regimes? Why such differences in hospital attendances across the country? Why such variations in community optometry involvement? Why such variations in teleophthalmology uptake? Studies such as this one, undertaken by Manjula Kumarasamy in Aberdeen, will in the future be able to be achieved much more easily and with vast data sets. Here she's looked at the one-stop model, and which has been pioneered in Ayrshire and Arran for many, many years, looking at the impact of relying on optometrists to identify patients suitable for cataract surgery, following that up with a telephone call and seeing patients on the day of surgery. This paper, albeit on a small scale, shows very encouraging evidence that what Ayrshire and Arran have been saying for years and years is actually true. So, what is the real importance of digital eye care, all the information that's going to come out of it? Well, hopefully it's going to be an end to gobsat. Good old boys sat around the table, banging the table, shouting and telling you how it should be done. There'll be no more magical me, where it's all about personality. Instead, facts will drive the way forward. Thank you very much.
That's great, John, and a fantastic talk packed with real gems. So keep your questions flying in, and we move from good old boys to the vanguard of the next generation of bright clinical academic ophthalmologists, none brighter than our next speaker, Jonathon Foulds, who has a keen interest in oculoplastics. He's going to tell us about the application of teleophthalmology innovation in his particular field of interest. So, Jonathon, the floor's virtually yours.
Hello, my name is Jonathon Foulds, and I am a consultant oculoplastic surgeon working in NHS Fife, Scotland. Thank you for inviting me to talk to you today on teleophthalmology as an innovative way to help improve oculoplastic care as a research strategy. COVID-19 poses and has posed an unprecedented challenge to ophthalmic service delivery. However, it has also created a unique opportunity to rapidly expand and promote new uses of telemedicine. This offers distinct benefits to both clinicians and patients by supporting social distancing, enabling continued service delivery, and by helping to reduce anticipated surge of demand which has been created by the numbers of patients not coming into hospital and being backlogged. Within my own service here in Fife, after the initial onslaught of the pandemic, I had 204 outstanding oculoplastic patients waiting to see me as of August 2020. And as the only oculoplastic surgeon in my health board, I was looking for novel ways to review and manage my workload. So, how best to take this on? Well, looking at the literature at this time would suggest that telemedicine may have a role. Kang and his team in Moorfields looked at 66 patients using video consultation and found that they were able to identify patients requiring urgent surgery. They felt that the development of teleophthalmology and oculoplastics will lead the way in the form of the use of digital photography and video consultations. Closer to home, Jameson et al. And his team from Glasgow also provided a huge cohort of patients that underwent video consultation, and again they found this to be an extremely useful tool, particularly when looking at certain conditions such as ectropion, entropion, dermatochalasis and postoperative reviews. Slightly less so with other things like watery eyes, lid lesion, conjunctival lesions. So, what was the current setup I was dealing with? Well, we've already mentioned the 209 patients which were waiting to see me. However, I decided to look at this more closely, and when I audited all the patients that attended the oculoplastic service from the year 2019, I found that there were 441 new patients, of which only 11% had an image attached to the referral. And of these, only 8% were felt to be discernible or good enough quality. Going further than this, looking at the patients who were seen with images, 38% had a lower rate of immediate discharge, and 77% versus 53% had a higher rate of actually requiring some form of treatment in the form of surgery. So, armed with this information, I therefore wanted to try and reduce the new patient oculoplastic referrals coming into the service, also known as prospective patients. I wanted to reduce the current waiting list, or the retrospective patients, those who are already waiting to be seen. I wanted to reduce the unnecessary clinic appointments, and I wanted to minimise the risk of transmissible disease for patients and clinicians. And the way I wanted to do this was by implementing the use of high quality digital images in the oculoplastic referrals sent to me from the community. So, how do we go about this? Well, I was lucky enough to obtain funding from the Scottish Government, which allowed me to procure 4 high-quality Topcon high-resolution slit lamp cameras back in May this year. All new oculoplastic referrals, unless considered life or vision threatening, must include an image. So anything which might be regarded as maybe a basal cell carcinoma or a melanoma would get seen immediately. Everything else otherwise would need to have an image attached. And if the practitioner was unable to provide a good quality image, the patient must attend something called a PAC optometrist, which is a term created for plastics in the community. So what about these PAC optometrists? So what I did was I devised 4 strategically placed optometry practices throughout the region I work, in the towns of Dunfermline, Leven, Cooper and Glenrothes. And this should theoretically manage to balance all the patients favourably between each practice without causing too much of a demand for each one individually. We set up an initial education meeting at which we were able to develop standard operating performers, or in other words, a way of how to actually take photographs and what types of images I would be after. Following on from this, we've continued to have monthly meetings to iron out any difficulties in the process. So, as an example of one of the standard operating procedures which we created, here's one for dermatochalasis or ptosis, for example. Please photograph both eyes in low magnification in the primary position, with the patient looking straight ahead. Try to ensure that we can see whether the pupil is obscured by the upper lid. Please photograph the patient looking downwards. Please photograph the patient with the excess upper lid skin lifted upwards. And please provide recent visual fields. We can only offer surgery to those patients that have evidence of visual field loss. The images were then to be emailed on to NHS 5 Ophthalmic Department and were to only include a KI number and date of referral. I asked specifically for no patient information on top of this to come so that the audit was accurately done to see whether it works properly. The images are uploaded to Clinical Portal, which is a significant advantage. One, because our optometrists have access to Clinical Portal, which means that other optometrists can actually see these images which have been created. So it's a patient record. And 2, without using medical illustration services within the hospital, which could be an alternative way of doing this, often I find that lots of people don't have access to this, and it means that all different types of clientele or staff working in the department will be able to see these images. So if I have varying registrars from month to month, they will all be able to access this, as well as nursing practitioners. All images were reviewed by myself, consultant, and triaged at this point. So, first of all, looking at the retrospective patients, letters were sent out to all the patients detailing that due to the COVID-19 pandemic, we have had to make changes to how we run the service and identifying why they were to go and get a photograph done. All pathologies were included, including entropion, ectropion, lid lesions, dermatochalasis, ptosis, epiphora, proptosis, and any other orbital pathology. A flowchart was created for the optometrists. As you can see here at the top of the chart, a letter was sent from the NHS to the optometrist detailing who the patient was. They were then advised to contact the patient within a period of 2 weeks. All conditions, as said, were included and consent was obtained, and the standard operating performer was followed before sending these images in to us. What about the results? So, of a total of 204 retrospective patients that we have received PAC images, for 90 of them, that's 44%. Now that data is slightly skewed because at the time that we sent this letters out, 40 of the patients had already been actually appointed into this service, so they wanted to just keep their appointments. So there was a slightly false detail there. Of the 90 patients that we did receive PAC images for, 32% or 30 were discharged, and 24 were listed directly for surgery. That, in essence, saved 54 hospital appointments, or 6.75 clinics in total, bearing in mind that the clinics have been reduced to around about 8 to 9 patients per clinic due to the pandemic restrictions. Of these 90 patients that had PAC imaging, a decision was made to see 36 of them in the clinic, of which 8 were found were malignant lesions, 13 were epiphora, 13 were ptosis, 1 lacrimal gland swelling, and 1 ectropion. And it was our belief that the PAC images were really well suited to lid malposition. So particularly those entropions or ectropions. What about the prospective patients? So again, a flowchart was created for our own staff within the hospital. So when the referral comes in, it was triaged by my Kuru team, who decide whether the referral is suitable for PAC. Is it a lid lesion or a malignant lid lesion, in which case that would not be suitable? That's something I would want to see immediately within the clinic. So anything suspicious like a melanoma, squamous cell carcinoma would get seen in the clinic within a 2-week period. Basal cell carcinomas, again, wouldn't really be included in this criteria or group of people, again, would be seen very urgently. Others, however, so the benign lid lesions, the entropions, the ectropions, the ptosis, the dermatochalasis, would all be sent a letter detailing them to go to the nearest PAC optometrist, and that was a letter to the optometrist and to the patient. A spreadsheet or audit form is completed, and the idea was obviously to get the images back to me within a 4-week period. Those who weren't getting images back within the 4-week period were sent follow-up letters to try and increase uptake as best as possible, and thus allowing another 2 weeks. And if the letters or the pictures hadn't come through by this point, then they were automatically put back into clinic at this stage. So, how did we get on? Thus far, we've collected data for around about 6 months, and we've had 191 referrals. Interestingly, 99 of those have come from general practitioners, 75 from the optometrist, 8 from allied health professionals like dermatology, 7 from colleagues into referrals in ophthalmology, 1 from orthoptists, and 1 from the diabetic retinal screening program. 48 of these referrals were appointed directly to the clinic, of which 32 came with an initial image right from the very beginning. 25 were discharged directly. Again, 21 of those came with an image directly. And 16 were listed directly for surgery. Again, 16, a high number, came with good imaging. Thus, that left us with 102 who we put forward for the PAC imaging. Of these, only 9 had an initial image, felt not to be good enough to triage correctly. Of the 102 patients who were referred on for these PAC images, 74 or 73% we got images back from, 55% we were able to discharge once we had that image, 22% were appointed on to the clinic, and 23% were listed directly for surgery. So, how long did it take to get these images back? Well, the average was 32 days. Unfortunately, this was slightly skewed because one of the practices was behind the times in actually getting their slit lamp up and running, so they were actually about 2 months behind. There was also a large focus in dealing with the retrospective lot of patients at this stage. That's obviously been ironed out now. We're not doing any more retrospectives. So at the last point that we looked at this over the last couple of months alone, not over the whole 6-month period, this on average has come down to 21 days. The average time for the image to be received and then acted upon or triaged by myself was 2 days. So what about some examples of the types of things we've been getting in? Well, here you can see images for patients referred in with lid-type cysts. The one on the left here you can see is been referred in with as a basal cell carcinoma, but clearly you can see that with the normal lid architecture, no loss of lashes, that this is really just a simple papilloma. This contrasts, however, to the other one on the right, which was referred in as a chalazion. Now, going back to the 2019 data, a referral for chalazion without image would have been put into a sort of nurse-led clinic and on average would take around about 9 to 12 months to be seen. However, with this particular picture, you can see that it's not really a typical chalazion. You've got the induration of the eyelid, the loss of the lashes, and this would be slightly more consistent with a basal cell carcinoma. So this is obviously a lot more sinister, and with the receipt of this image, we were able to get this patient in immediately. The next pictures were both referred as lesions which were causing structural impairment. The one on the left, as you can see, is a very small lesion, obviously not impacting the vision, so this was deemed to be more aesthetically unacceptable and a cosmetic issue. This patient was obviously discharged. Whereas the one on the right obviously had a lot more issues with mechanical weight on the upper eyelid, and we were able to put this patient directly on the waiting list. With regard to lid malposition, you can just see a series of photographs here which show the lower eyelid turning out the way, or also known as the ectropion. You can see the still for the whole face, as well as the closer up image of the ectropion on the left, and the middle picture showing the photographer or the optometrist actually putting some tension on the eyelid and showing that we were able to put the lid into a much more natural position, showing that this patient would benefit from surgery directly. So this patient was put directly on the waiting list for surgery. When we put a patient on the waiting list for surgery, they're sent a standardised letter detailing what we're going to do, what the risks are, and if there's any issues that they can contact my secretary directly, at which point I can get back in touch with the patient via a telephone consultation. The opposite to the ectropion is the interning of the eyelid, or the entropion, which you can see nice and clearly in this picture. Again, you can see that by putting some tension onto the lateral aspect of the eyelid, puts that eyelid into a much more natural position, and this patient was again put directly onto my waiting list for a horizontal shortening, and again the patient has done very well, and that's really shortened the period of time. So the patient journey has been significantly better, so it's been a really good process. This patient here, example 5, has been referred in as a ptosis. The picture on the left and the right is the same patient, and what's actually happened here is the picture on the right shows the mechanical lifting of the skin, and as you can see from that, that is not a ptosis. The eyelid is not dropping down and obscuring the pupillary margin. This patient obviously had a heavy brow and was more consistent with a dermatochalasis. If we look at the next example, again something similar. You can see by lifting the skin, it sits in a better position, again referred as a ptosis, but as you can see this is a dermatochalasis, and by the benefit of having the associated visual fields with this patient, you can see that it is obscuring or having a problem with this, so this patient would be suitable to put on a NHS waiting list. I've included this as well. This is a recent patient that I've had as well. This was referred as an ectropion by the optometrist. This, going back to my 2019 data, would have been a patient that would have been again waiting for around about 9 to 12 months for something relatively simple. As you can see at the bottom, it was a cosmetic issue rather than actually a painful issue for the patient. However, when we received images for this patient, you can see that from the primary position, it doesn't look particularly healthy, and then when you see the closer up image on the slit lamp camera, you can see that the lid itself is sitting in a natural position. It's not turned out the way, and in fact what we're looking at here is a mechanical weight of the conjunctiva causing a problem. This patient has subsequently been biopsied and has been diagnosed with a lymphoproliferative disease for which they're now undergoing treatment. So as you can imagine, this has been a significant improvement or benefit for the patient having these images in place. So it's a work in progress. We have saved 58 hospital clinical appointments with the prospective data so far. That's 7.25 full clinics. So this has been a significant improvement for patients and their journey. We've looked a bit at feedback as well. So we looked at optometrists first of all. We found that those patients who were referred for photography, it had been straightforward. 75% of people agreed. The optometrists felt that patients were happy to attend for the photographs, and that was for 100% of patients. Patients have generally been well informed. There was a bit of disproportionate results here at 50-50. Again, I think this was to do with the initial letters going out. Sometimes the letters didn't accompany, so we've been addressing this as time's gone on, so I think this number is likely to improve. The optometrists felt that it was easy to fit patients into their clinic. They didn't have any issues with this. They found that, again, 100% of the optometrists found that sending images in was very straightforward, wasn't time consuming. 100% agreed that taking part in this project was a very positive experience for them. On average, it takes about 15 to 30 minutes for all of them to do this for a patient. We asked whether they ran designated clinics for them or whether they intertwined these patients into their clinics. 25% had a designated packed clinic, whereas 75% just did it ad hoc as required. And once they received a referral, on average, do they see the patient within 2 weeks, 3 weeks, 4 weeks? And there's a bit of discrepancy here at the moment. But again, I think this is largely because a lot of this data has been looking at both the retrospective and the prospective patients. Patient feedback has been also, we're currently looking at, so we can't give you that information or data exactly at this particular point because we are currently undertaking this. However, it's been very positive responses thus far. In general, patients understand why they have been called for photography. Patients are happy to attend optometrists that they are not familiar with, and patients are happy to re-attend optometrists for photography again in the future. So, in conclusion, teleophthalmology in the community appears to be a reliable method for screening in ocular plastics. The improved development in communication with optometrists opens up many new avenues. And with the trends in increased mobile use and that of social media suggest that this could be improved even further going forward. Thank you.
That's great, Jonathan. Fantastic talk. And that brings us to the end of this trio of really excellent presentations. So we do have plenty of time for discussion. All the three speakers have showered down, they've changed their tops, they're ready for some Q&A. And if we take the questions in order of how they're presented, Barny, could we ask you a few questions? The first is related, we've got an audience that includes a global studentship. We've got some of our global master's students. We've got a huge variety of individuals who have logged in. They might ask the question about BOSU and what is the future. I mean, I know that the funding and possibly the ethics extends UK-wide, but is there any thought to extending this inquiry into rare conditions beyond the shores of the UK?
Yes, there is, and that there has been. We've made some efforts over our 25 years to try and expand the network of rare eye disease surveillance. We originally took our idea from the British Paediatric Surveillance Unit, which does essentially what we do, but in diseases of childhood. And they have an international network of about 18 units from a wide variety of countries and in representation in most continents. We did have at one point a sister unit in Australasia, so the Australian and New Zealand Ophthalmic Surveillance Unit. But unlike in Britain, the Australian ophthalmologists really didn't grab hold of the idea and didn't participate in big enough numbers to support epidemiological research. So they produced a few papers that essentially became case series as opposed to incident studies. And in the end, the unit kind of folded a bit. And I think one of the difficulties here is for pediatricians, surveillance is very intuitive. They spend a lot of time looking at healthy children trying to spot disease, and so it's often part of their working lives. It's not so intuitive for ophthalmologists, but we're very lucky in the UK that we have a health service that is set up to allow us to make that link between rare diseases and the underlying population. And other countries' ophthalmic services aren't necessarily set up in that way. So, for example, one of the reasons they thought it didn't work in Australia was that there was a large number working in private practice, whereas they don't have that universal sort of or nigh on universal national health service. Likewise, you couldn't really do it in a system like America, where no one really knows who sees which doctor, so you don't know the underlying population that's being surveyed. And so, sure, we would love international comparisons, because that way, especially when you're working with small data sets, you can you can either combine the studies to provide bigger data sets, or you can compare them to look at things like environmental factors and such like. But unfortunately, we don't have that option at the moment. We're striking it out alone, but we're always willing to be encouraging.
Okay, and I guess just leading on from that, in terms of setting up BOSU, and I know that you've been leading this for some years. With regard to ethics and the challenge of ethical approval for this, what were the bear traps? How did you get around it? And is it an ongoing process? Do you have to apply for ethics each time you run another BOSU study?
Yes, it's, essentially, and the bear traps are many, and that's really one of the motivating factors behind the switch to a digital system, is that it's not just the ethical approval, which actually is not too difficult to get, but it's obtaining the legal waiver to collect identifying information without the patient consent. And it's very important for a surveillance study that we don't need to collect patient consent, because if we were to collect patient consent, doctors would be having to call, excuse me, would have to be calling patients in purely for the necessity to get their consent often. And that would actually scupper our ascertainment quite significantly. And so we've had real problems with ever increasing stricter information governance ruling. But by switching to this digital system, we'll be holding all of our studies, we'll be holding their data in a data safe haven at the University of Dundee. And by doing that, we will have one set of answers to the questions about information governance, and those answers will be ones that will satisfy the committees, in the sense that all studies will be using the same high standards of information governance, whereas actually for a lot of researchers, especially those who are outside the main academic centres, finding out what the information governance procedures are in their hospital, if it's a local district general hospital, can often be very difficult. And when doing that alongside a clinical job, it really prevents and delays the start of studies. And so that's what we're doing to try and address that.
Okay. Yeah, so a shout out to our Tayside colleagues and Idris in Dundee. And then finally, Barney, we've got a question relating to what is your favourite BOSU study? I suppose it's a little bit like choosing your favourite kid. It's a difficult one, I know, but if there's somebody tuning in, and I'm sure this isn't true, but they've never read a BOSU study, which one would you point them towards and why?
That's difficult, because I suppose for a lot of people, they prefer the ones where they that match their subspecialty, or that they had an interest in. I suppose maybe I can pick a few. I think number one was the endophthalmitis following cataract surgery study, which of course actually we don't need to do now, because the NOD database can provide that information more clearly than we could. But at the time, it was a very important study, and I think also it really captured the sort of mainstream element that how a rare event or a rare occurrence or rare disease can actually influence everyday practice. And so I think that demonstrated to ophthalmologists that BOSU, the importance of BOSU, and that really set us on our way. And so that was an important study. Obviously, the childhood blindness studies have had huge impact, and we've done those. That's been repeated, and internationally, that's probably the most high profile, and certainly one of the few that got published in a general medical journal. And then I suppose if I had to pick mine, maybe it was firework injuries, just simply because it always amuses me that Guy Fawkes didn't probably think about the impact on public health when he decided to try and blow up the House of Parliament.
Okay, well, nor the impacts on cats and dogs, of course, of
absolutely
going off unexpectedly. Okay, Barney, thanks for that. So we could move to John next. John, you touched on a historic journey that you took in terms of clinical research. We've got a huge number of trainees who have tuned in, and from your talk, you kind of fell into it by chance. I mean, if you were to tell your younger trainee self about, in terms of advice, how to get into research, what would you say?
Not to be frightened of it, to look at it as an opportunity, and to go and knock on doors. There are always people who have studies in mind but don't have the time to do it, but have the time to supervise it. There's always more. Once you get into research and start thinking about things, there's always more questions. And if you're looking at making an impact on clinical care, sometimes the questions are very obvious, but nobody's actually addressed them. I mean, we looked at optical coherence tomography for macular edema in patients attending retinal screening, because 90% of patients being referred to ophthalmology from retinal screening were being referred on the basis of hard exudates, and only a tiny percentage of them appeared to have an edema when they appeared in ophthalmology. So we all knew there was this big problem, but no one was really prepared to bite the bullet and do the study. So that was kind of like an obvious study to do. I think the problem with training is the current model, people go straight into ophthalmology, have not got experience of any other specialty. I mean, I'd worked in lots of different specialties, and when I came to ophthalmology, I had quite a lot of different views about how things might be done, or how you went about balancing risk, or how you use drugs and so on. That was quite different to what ophthalmology was doing. So to me, there was lots of obvious questions that came to mind. Why are you doing this? Why are you doing that? And I think you need to realize that in 50 years' time, maybe sooner, quite a lot of the things that we do nowadays may not be thought that well of. Our practice is completely different from how it was. Even when I started training, when you looked at ophthalmology notes, all you really saw was refraction. That's what ophthalmologists did when you came to clinic, to refraction. And that was the main thing. So go and talk, and it'll help you question what you're taught, because a lot of it's just based on oral tradition rather than actual fact.
Okay, yeah, sound advice, John. So the next question relates to the relevance in terms of DRS of wide field imaging, given the peripheral phenotype and the potential utility of looking in the periphery. What are your views on that with regard to the SOP and the current practice of data capture in imaging?
I think from a point of view of realistic medicine, using resources sensibly, quite a lot of what's done in ophthalmology traditionally will end up being done by retinal screening. And what I mean by that is that retinal screening has had a reasonably low threshold for referring patients to ophthalmology, first of all with macular edema, and then with query proliferative retinopathy. Yeah. Now, the wide field scanning laser ophthalmoscope is an interesting story, because right at the beginning of retinal screening in 2001, there was the Optos, it did exist, but they refused to do any clinical trials. They refused to prove that it could actually detect retinopathy as well as any other methodology, so it never got utilized. So if you're talking about screening, what you're talking about is taking a sample. You don't need to take the whole image to screen a patient to identify that they're at a certain threshold. There's no point looking for new vessels in the periphery or lesions in the periphery if there's no retinopathy at the disc stroke macula. We know that the sensitivity is good enough for that. I think what will happen is that rather than, same with OCT, rather than referring patients to ophthalmology to see whether they've got fluid or not, that will happen in retinal screening. And I think what will happen with wide field ophthalmoscopy is that will happen in retinal screening as well. So what you will actually receive in ophthalmology will be patients who need injection therapy or laser. As to the actual ability for wide field ophthalmoscopy to have automated grading, to have artificial intelligence applied, that has been shown. The person that did quite a lot of the work in Aberdeen, the computer scientist Alan Fleming, now works and heads Optos's research lab, and he has shown that you can do exactly the same. So it comes down to the fact that if you grab a really wide field image, you've got to look at all of it, and that's a time basis. So it's not always the case that more is better.
Okay. And then finally, John, you mentioned Open Eyes, the work that you're doing following your departure from clinical ophthalmology. And What do you see? I mean, you mentioned a couple of things in terms of R&D potential with open eyes. How do you see, for maybe a young trainee who wants to explore an aspect of research in images generated through open eyes, what is the potential that is embedded within the system? I know the rollout is going to be over the next few years, so it might be worth thinking about now.
Yeah, I think the issue of images, whether images will be in open eyes or not, is up for debate, or whether they'll be in their own patient archive communication system. But there will be a lot of information about patients. And I think one of the first things that will come out will be relatively simple, standardizing post-operative cataract drop regime. There are so many different variations for no good reason. I mean, essentially, open eyes is going to provide huge amounts of data, just like Sky Diabetes has shown. So what I would advise people is go and look at the Scottish Diabetes Survey. It's about 180 pages long. Go and look at Sky Diabetes, and go and look at diabetes, because the story of diabetes is exactly the same as what's happening to ophthalmology now. In 2000, 2001, up until that point, everybody with diabetes attended a hospital diabetes clinic. Well, that's what the diabetologists believed, because that was the only place retinal screening could occur. But the patient numbers just became too great. It became impossible for all the people with diabetes to go to the hospital. And we're seeing the same thing with ophthalmology. It's impossible for everybody to come to the hospital. So I'm kind of lost my train of thought there, but diabetologists became much more interested in big data, because that way you could look after patients in much more effective ways and keep most of them out of the hospital. And that is going to be the situation for ophthalmology as well. We're going to know where all our patients are. We're going to know what their health is. We're going to know what's going to go on. We're going to have information coming back, and we'll be asking ourselves, well, why is it that Grampian has a certain conversion rate for cataract surgery from referral, but it's half that of what's in Tayside? And Edinburgh is twice as high as everybody else. We'll be looking at conversion rates from optometry, etc. So there's lots of things that will be there that we just haven't had access to. So that's why I see it going.
Yeah. I think the inter-regional variance in practice is something that is low-hanging fruit in terms of that. But thanks, John, for that. And coming on to Jonathan, we have a question relating to optometrists who may be part of the scheme. And we've got a question that asks, could there be, I suppose, an element of favoritism in favouring one optometrist over another? I think that was the gist of the question, Jonathan.
Yeah. No, that's was definitely probably my biggest concern starting off, that it was going to create some form of competition bias. Thankfully, it hasn't. I think there's two reasons for that. One is because we've run educational evenings for the optometrists, discussing everything, and actually saying that because I own the slit lamps, that we can move them around into different optometry practices if they wish. The second thing is that it comes down to money. And the setup that we've got with the optometrists is that they earn a certain amount of money, which is actually a lot less doing these images than what it would be to actually review a patient in practice. So yeah, the setup we've got is that they can charge about £24.50 to get an image. And I think normally, a sort of primary care examination comes in about £42. So it's not financially beneficial for these optometrists to particularly do these images, but they are happy to do them because they like being involved with the hospital.
Okay. And in terms of the resource, an optometry and ophthalmology training and education, it's invaluable. I mean, the repository of even just a few of those images, if you expand them up significantly, you can foresee that would be an immense educational resource. So is there the capability embedded within your system to de-identify images and use them for teaching, training, education?
Yeah, exactly that. So we're already onto that. So all the images are stored. We've got access to them, and you're right. So what we're doing here in Fife is we're running educational evenings for the optometrists. So we've run one of them already. A lot of positive feedback, planned on running them quite often and more often.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. And just finally, because I know we're coming up to time, has a similar piece of work been done on any other part of the body? I'm not sure what the question is getting at, but in terms of parallel studies in dermatology.
Yeah, I think you're right. Dermatology have looked at different ways of doing this. I think the problem that people are having is they're not quite sure how best to pass the images around. So I think speaking to dermatology colleagues, there's been a lot of discussion around using Pando as an example. And I think the problem people are having is that, you know, the dermatologists are not wanting images pinged to them at 11 o'clock at night, for example, and then something alerting them, and then they feel that they have to act on something at certain times of day. So no one's really found a smooth way of passing images around yet. So I think certainly with the eyes, it's working really, really well. And the slit lamp cameras are just fantastic. They're really, really good to get a really detailed, high quality image. So, you know, certainly from our point of view, it's worked well. But I think, you know, this is the type of thing which could be expanded. So, you know, I do liaise quite closely with other specialties like dermatology and plastics. So I think there'll definitely be some overlap to use this type of thing in the community.
Sure. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of the Q&A. Thank you to all three speakers. Brilliant talks. And just generally, thanks to Roshni Sanders for putting this excellent program together. Thanks also to CSO. I think the talks, there's a theme running through them in terms of the power of the NHS and harnessing this very special healthcare system for the greater good, whether it's in research, teaching, training, education, epidemiology, you name it. You know, it is a unique capability. So thank you for CSO for supporting this. And big shout out to Ollie, who behind the scenes has been keeping everything on time, well coordinated. And thank you all for joining and tuning in. I hope you're enjoying it thus far, and I'm sure you'll enjoy the rest of the day. So thank you very much, everyone.